Hi there, folks, and welcome back to this next episode of Mama Reads Grief. Thanks for joining me on our continuing journey of my story. I thought tonight I'd give it a whirl without the background noise of my two energetic boys. We left off last time round about the stage of going into labor. So I was explaining my exuberant enthusiasm over giving birth. And I think it might be just a little bit weird in that respect because I really do like that part. I really do. Not to say that it's easy, but it's just, I'm not a thrill seeker, and I guess that's probably my biggest thrill. So, I'm just going to read a few sentences and jump right in. There is no greater joy than when they place that sweet, beautiful baby in my arms. There is no greater gift outside of my salvation than the gift of my children's lives. There is no greater responsibility from God than the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being of my babies. Knowing all of Garrett's health concerns and the reality of surgery very soon after birth, I still could think of nothing other than him joining me out here. Praise my Father in heaven for that time. In hindsight, as I reflect on the hours of his birth, I realized that I didn't think about his heart condition and surgery or the possibility of him being Down syndrome. All I thought about in those hours before delivery was that I was soon going to be a mommy again. I did experience that beautiful sensation of release, and they placed Garrett in my arms. I was allowed to hold him for a few moments before they took him across the room to begin attaching the lines. I remember watching them clean him off and check him out and just aching to have him in my arms, wanting so desperately just to hold him. It seemed like forever before they brought him back over to me. The nurse laid him in my arms, and I felt whole and complete. I looked into his precious little face, and all I could think about was how happy I was to meet this little boxer face to face. He did look like a little boxer too. His little hands were balled into tight fists, and his face was all scrunched up. I was sure he needed to fight. He needed the fight in him. You see, I had no doubt that God was going to bring him through all of the tough times that lay ahead for him. His life was not going to be an easy one. I knew he had to have a lot of fight in him to get through it all. I held him in my arms and cried with joy to have him. He didn't look up at me. His eyes weren't open then, but I knew that he knew me instantly, for as soon as I brought him close to me, he began to calm. How can I possibly have part in bringing forth someone so beautiful, so precious and joyous? I looked at him and told him how much I love him. I didn't want to let him go, but I had to hand him back to the nurse. It took every ounce of my energy at that point to let them take him, as I knew it would be a while before I could hold him again. I knew that they would be taking him to the NICU. I could go there as much as I needed, but they had to take him as soon as they could to begin testing his heart. The doctor couldn't confirm the coarctation until Garrett was born, and they had to determine when exactly they needed to do Garrett's first surgery. When they finished with me and I was able to move, which I determined was right after, they took me to the NICU to see Garrett. Because of his heart condition, his mouth, his hands, and feet were bluish. His little head was purple from being bruised during delivery. This was normal and had nothing to do with his heart. Other than that, when I looked at him, it was so hard to believe that he was as sick as he was. He was born at 7 pounds and 10 ounces and was 21 inches long. He was so big, so healthy looking. Though there was much talk of Down syndrome, he showed no obvious signs of it. I just couldn't believe it. He didn't look sick. I was wheeled into the NICU and brought back to Garrett. I saw him lying in his bed with an oxygen tube in his pudgy little nose and heart monitor pads on his chest and lines in his belly button. All I wanted to do was wrap him in one of those hospital receiving blankets and carry him back to my room with me. Whew. I wanted to pull his hospital bed up next to mine and watch him sleep and listen to him breathe. I'm going to take a minute and just explain something. I cannot remember if I explained it in the first video. There was a lot of chaos and a lot of, you can't imagine unless you're there right now. Then you can't imagine, and you do know. But, or if you've been there, you can certainly recall those memories. But in having him in the hospital and going through everything and coming home and I didn't have him, and the intense grief. There was one pervading thought at that time, and that was, I'm taking it back, two pervading thoughts at that time. And that was, one, I don't want to forget. I don't want to forget anything. I have nothing. I can't hold, and I can't hold a blanket that he laid under. I can't walk into his room and look at his bed. I can't imagine him in a car seat coming home. I have nothing. I don't want to forget. And the second thing is, I don't have anything, but I have this gut aching pain, and I do not want to let go of that. So I began to write, and that's why I began to write, because I had 2 children at home already, and I began to write to share the story with them someday. I didn't want to forget, and I was not ready to let go. I was probably 4 or 5 days out of walking away from him in the hospital. I walk away from him. I come home. I'm talking about funeral arrangements, and it just didn't seem real. None of it seemed real, and I wanted to remember. And right then I could remember. It's all I thought about. And so I started writing and furiously pounded on the keyboard to begin putting these thoughts down so that I wouldn't forget. So I want to come back to some ideas that I have right now later about how this turned into the book, and then how I used it in the early years of my grieving. But I just felt it necessary, because I don't think I explained that with the previous video that I made, the reason that the book came about. I might have hit on it, but there it is, and that's where I was. And so now I'm coming back to these memories, and it occurred to me that you might not know what inspired me to write it. Now back to this. And it is a little hard not to read this and sink back into it. So, like I said in my first video, we'll see together how I respond, I guess. All I wanted to do was wrap him in one of those hospital receiving blankets and carry him back to my room with me. I wanted to pull his hospital bed up next to mine and watch him sleep and listen to him breathe. I wanted to hold him. No, I needed to hold him. I looked at the nurse, tears running down my cheeks, and said, I just want to hold him. My heart was hurting to see him lay there. I didn't know how much I could touch him, let alone hold him. I thank God for the compassion she had. She didn't say anything. She just very gently began to rearrange his wires and tubes so that I wouldn't disturb anything. When she completed, she laid him in my arms. Oh, sweet joy. I held him as close to me as I could and cried tears of joy and relief just to have him in my arms again. I cherished him and clung to him desperately. The nurse that was caring for him was so tender and compassionate. Praise the Lord. The nurse that was caring for him was so tender and compassionate. Praise the Lord, he took pictures of Mike and me with our baby boy. What treasures those 2 pictures were. Those 2 pictures are. I knew at that moment that my life was going to change, but I was not aware of how drastic that change would be. Well, by the time I had gotten to the NICU to see and, praise God, hold my Garrett, it was after 4 in the morning and I was exhausted. They had confirmed that he did indeed have the coarctation along with the AV canal. I was told that he would need to be transferred to Children's Hospital for his first surgery soon. However, they wanted to give him a day or two to get a little stronger after birth in hopes that he would be better able to keep breathing strong. So having been assured and reassured that Garrett would be fine and well cared for, I had Mike wheel me back to my room. I was suddenly beyond exhausted. I could barely keep my eyes open. I sent Mike home to be with the kids and try to get a good amount of sleep before he returned later in the morning. Wow, what a day. I woke at 8 a.m. It was February 7th and Garrett was just 5 hours and 41 minutes old. I took my time moving around the room. I figured I would have at least 2 days before they were going to move Garrett from St. John's to Children's Hospital. Little side note, in St. Louis, Missouri. Plenty of time to move slowly, shower, do my hair, put on makeup, and look presentable for the first day. And look presentable, yes, for the day. It wasn't my first day, it was just another day. I called Mike and checked in with him. I let him know everything that I would need for the next few days and told him to bring the kids up with him around noon or 1. Then Brother Barker, our assistant pastor, came up to visit me and we talked for a while. When he left, I ordered breakfast, ate, and got dressed. By that time, it was about 11 a.m. and Carolyn had just gotten there. We were just starting to talk and make our way down to the NICU when Dr. Gohl entered my room. Oh, hang on a second, I'm sorry about that. Dr. Gohl entered my room. I wasn't alarmed when he came in. I was expecting to see him. I knew he had to give the final official diagnosis on Garrett. He began with the most obvious and only good news that he had, and that was that Garrett was not Down syndrome. That was the one and only time that I felt relief when speaking to a doctor. What was to come was the beginning of the end of my entire world. It all changed in one breath. The words that Dr. Gohl spoke in the next half hour brought validity to a fear that pecked at the bottom of my stomach for 2 long months. The very fear that I refused to voice, denied access to my thoughts, and absolutely would not accept as a possibility for my baby. Here I was listening to what the doctor was saying, and all the while I thinking to myself that he must be speaking to the wrong mother. He positively, and I mean positively, could not mean my son. Surely he was mistaken because as I listened, I heard him say that Garrett's heart was sicker than we could tell from the beginning. There it was again, that feeling like the whole world was tilting, then spinning, then tilting again. Back and forth, then back and forth as I somehow managed to sit still. I couldn't feel my hands or my feet at different times, and I was seeing spots in my eyes. Kind of like I would lose my vision for a second and everything would look foggy, and then I could see the doctor again. This went on the entire time he spoke. What exactly was he saying? My mouth was moving and I was asking questions, so I suppose my mind was computing what was being said, but some part of me just was not understanding anything. Was this really happening? What was he saying? For crying out loud, was he really talking to me? Garrett was confirmed to have AV canal, we already knew this, and a coarctation, again we knew. But he didn't have just one coarctation, he had 2. There were 2 spots along the aorta that were narrow, one in the arch and the other at the valve. Dr. Gold informed me that this would need to be repaired right away. However, Garrett also had hypoplastic left heart syndrome. This was not easy to diagnose before because the AV canal was misleading. Now Dr. Gold was not sure this would be as simple a procedure as was previously thought. Along with that, he had the 2 coarctations to repair. But all of that had to be put aside because the thing they had to focus on first was the leaky valve that they discovered just that morning when they did the ultrasound. Dear Lord, God in heaven, have I heard him correctly? A leaky valve? My God, my God. What was my son anyway? Was he a precious little baby, a beautiful life created in my belly, or a car waiting for a major overhaul? I felt them coming upon me, the tears. I pushed them back, swallowed down the lump in my throat, and continued my questions until I understood it all. I wish I would have cried right then. I wish I wouldn't have felt the need to pretend to be so strong. I have such a regard for tears now, and though it took me another day before I broke, I have not begrudged myself that release since. The doctor went on to explain the options that we were now looking at. With this particular valve leaking as badly as it was, we would have the choice of letting the heart surgeon attempt to repair the valve or do a complete heart transplant. Dr. Gold explained that Dr. Huddleston, the heart surgeon, had done the procedure of repairing the valve on other babies before without much success. If Dr. Gold had to make the call, he said that he would suggest a transplant. That is, if it looked like the valve was leaking as badly as he thought. This was now the new decision that we were facing. As I look back, I'm in awe and completely dumbfounded. How did it get this bad? We went from the scary situation of repairing Garrett's deformed heart to a surgery that had yet to be mortally successful, or possibly even a transplant. All of this being news that I was receiving less than 10 hours after Garrett's birth. There was no time for that set-apart, special, quiet bonding that I enjoyed and took so for granted with my other 2 babies. No time to watch him sleep. No time to pick him up for no reason at all and carry him around the room. No time to lay him in my arms and cuddle him close as we both leisurely napped. No time, no opportunities, just quick decisions and changes every moment along the way. Dr. Gold also informed me that Garrett's heart was now dispersing the oxygen throughout his entire body. So rather than take chances with him at St. John's, they were going to transfer him to Children's Hospital as soon as possible, meaning in just a matter of hours. They would put him in a breathing tube and attempt to level out the oxygen that way. I called Mike and told him to come up as soon as he could. I didn't want Garrett to be moved before Mike got to see him there. Again, we began calling everyone. Carolyn called Mom, and they got a hold of the rest of my side, and I told Mike to contact his family. I wasn't sure at that point if anyone would be able to see Garrett at Children's, so I wanted to give everyone the opportunity to spend a little time with him before he was moved. At this time, my nurse had become very adamant about me getting off my feet, or else she was not going to allow me to be released. I tried to be as good as I could, but what was I supposed to do? I mean, my tiny little, just hours old, baby boy was going to be taken away to another hospital with all kinds of tubes and wires attached to him, and I couldn't even hold his little hand while he was going. I know I had just given birth. If memory served me correctly, I was actually there for it. But my son was leaving that hospital, and there was no way in this world that I was going to let them take him away and leave me there. I had no choice. I wasn't just going to go back to bed and take a nice long nap while my baby boy was somewhere else completely, having who knows what done to him, all without my knowledge? Oh no, definitely not. I was most certainly going with him. As I said, I was as good as I could be. But I had to be with my son, and most of that time required me to be on my feet. Well, anyway, that was the least of my worries at the time. My main concern was Garrett. Still yet, with all the news we had received, my mind hadn't totally gone over to the dark possibility. It was still just an unspoken what if, barely even a fully formed thought before I pushed it out of my mind. I got to Children's Hospital around 3 p.m. that Wednesday with Mike and my mom. They already had Garrett settled into his room and all situated. The first nurse I met was Bert. I smile big when I think about him. He was a really neat guy. He took us back to Garrett's room, number 26, and began explaining everything that Garrett had attached to him. Of course, it had already been filled in on the breathing tube. I was actually there when they put it in at St. John's. I didn't watch them put it in, however. At that time, I just didn't want to see Garrett going through that. That changed later. So I was already aware of how Garrett looked. We had a lot of questions at that time. I don't remember everything we questioned Bert about, but I do remember him being so patient and understanding with us. He answered all of our questions and filled us in on things that we didn't know to ask. I remember Jessie, my childhood friend, came up to see us and Garrett. I was explaining Garrett's heart condition again, and Bert went online and printed out all of the information so that Jessie could take it back for everyone else. She was so good at keeping others informed and offer help in any way she could. All of the nurses and doctors at Children's were unbelievable. Phenomenal is the word that comes to my mind. And so Bert was one of those phenomenal nurses. He stays in my mind as one of the good points that I want to remember. He was so personable. When he would do anything for Garrett, he never did it without rubbing his arm or head or holding his hand. Bert showed such compassion to my son, and that immediately endeared him to my heart. Bert talked about how his daughter was sick and she asked for Edie's ice cream, the new kind called Dibs, and he didn't know what it was. He asked us if we knew and we filled him in on it. I know that is just normal conversation, but that is what was so special about it. He treated us normal. He already knew, more than did we, how sick Garrett was, yet he didn't act as if I was going to fall apart at any moment. Thus, Bert is a special man in my mind because of the special link he holds to my precious son. Garrett was stable at that time and doing as good as would be expected. After Garrett had gotten there and settled, the doctors had made mention to Bert that they might be able to remove the breathing tube. Garrett's oxygen saturation level had seemed to be evening out. This was great news. So yes, at the time we were still looking at surgery, but we were hoping that he would be able to wait a few days. I was just so happy to hear that bit of good news. I had brought my camera with me and was determined to get some pictures. I took several that night and I'm so very thankful that I did. I began taking pictures from all different angles, and some with Mom and them caressing his head. Those pictures are unbelievably precious to me. I know I continue to use and reuse the word precious, but it's hard to find the perfect word to describe Garrett and anything about him. Precious is the closest I can come to how I feel toward him, and that is lacking to some degree. Yes, those pictures and all the rest are so very precious to me. The third picture I took on that Wednesday, I happened to snap just as he turned his head to me and opened his eyes. I got that picture just as he looked right at me. I cannot describe how I feel about that picture. Phenomenal. My objective at that time was to take pictures that Wednesday, the 7th, and then not take any more until after his first successful heart surgery. I would have before and after pictures to show the amazing work God had done. I shortly found out that God's plan was much different from mine. Since Garrett was relatively stable that Wednesday evening, I thought all was going to be fine. So we gathered around Garrett's bed, Mom, Mike, and I. We talked with Bert for the remainder of his shift. He brought comfort as he was so helpful and willing to meet our needs. Bert's shift ended at 7 p.m. and Bev came on as Garrett's nurse. Bev was an astounding nurse. She was gentle, compassionate, and loving. Never did she do something for Garrett nearby or directly attached to him that she didn't cuddle him in some form. She's forever endeared to my heart for the way that she loved my son while she cared for him. She talked to him every time she came near him. She rubbed his head or his belly. She held his hand or his foot. She's a special woman, and one whom I will never forget. Mom left the hospital sometime between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. that night, and Mike and I stayed to be near Garrett. Hannah and Gabriel were with my sister, so I didn't have to worry about them at all. When Garrett was transported from St. John's to Children's, all of our family had been there. Everyone on both sides was there. I was thankful for that, and I knew it was hard for them as it was unbelievably hard for me. When Mike and I went in to see him at St. John's before he left, Mike began to cry. I asked him to stop, mainly because I didn't want to cry myself. I knew in my heart, I just knew that he was going to be okay. That was Wednesday afternoon, and here we were already at the end of the evening in Children's Hospital. It was just Mike and I in Garrett's room that night. We stayed by his bed until about 11:30 p.m., and then we both decided that we needed to get some sleep if we were going to make it through the next day. So we said goodnight to Garrett and made our way back to the parents' lounge. I walked through the halls back to the lounge and realized how many sick babies and young children were there. So many babies, so many children, and parents sleeping in chairs by their beds. We went back to the lounge only to find it filled. However, there was a very nice young man who gave us 2 chair beds that they weren't going to be using that night. We laid claim to those beds for the rest of our stay. After we woke the next morning and went to breakfast, we went up to see Garrett, and everything seemed to be okay. This was Thursday morning. Brother and Mrs. Barker came up to visit us, and Brother and Mrs. Barker came up to visit us and Garrett. And we lost my place. And we went into his room to see him. They had already put Garrett on a paralytic medication because of the breathing tube, so he wasn't responsive to our touch or voice. While we were in his room visiting, the monitors began to beep more frequently. I didn't understand everything they had him hooked up to, so I thought the nurse just needed to regulate it. The nurse that came on for the day shift was Sally. She was a fantastic nurse, and as Bev caressed and loved my baby boy while she cared for him, Sally did equally as much. She rubbed his belly, leaned close to him in his bed, and cuddled him. These 3 nurses that I've written of so fondly are the ones who have touched and changed my heart forever. Bert cared for Garrett as I've seen no man care for a baby that wasn't his own before. Being a man, one would think him to be a little less affectionate and a little more calloused. However, he cared for my Garrett as if he were his very own. And Bev and Sally loved and cared for my precious ones as they would their own grandbaby. There are no words to adequately express my feelings for the way that they changed my heart, these 3 nurses, or rather, angels. As I was saying, the monitors began to beep more frequently, so I thought that maybe he was becoming overstimulated. Drawing from past experiences with my daughter, I knew that babies could become overstimulated if there was too much activity around them. I was afraid this was happening, so I asked the Barkers if they would mind if we all left the room and let Garrett rest. They had to leave anyway, and we walked them out. As we were walking out, my brother and sister-in-law, John and Susan, and their daughter Debbie were coming in. Rather than get Garrett too wound up, we opted to go to lunch and let them visit him later. We all went to the cafeteria, had lunch, and came back up afterward. John and Susan went into the room with Mike, and I stayed out in the lounge with Debbie. After a short while, they all came back, and Mike told me that they wanted to speak with both of us in Garrett's room. They needed to talk to us together. Mike's family understood and left at that time. That was when we met Dr. Farber. I have never met another person like Dr. Farber in my life. She is amazing. I don't praise her lightly. I say nothing just for the sake of writing it. She touched my life immensely, leaving an enduring print on my heart. When we first met her, it was all business because, of course, she had news for us, and it wasn't good. As the day was progressing, they were discovering yet another problem for little Garrett. My little man had some mysterious situation going on inside his tiny little body. Remember I said they transported Garrett to Children's sooner than they had planned? They had to because of the oxygen situation. He was not receiving oxygen to all parts of his body, leading to why he needed the breathing tube. Well, they had gotten that under control, and now the problem was that his body wasn't retaining CO2. So the top half of his body was dispersing the oxygen as needed and expelling the carbon dioxide, but the lower half was retaining the CO2. Oh God, my God, they are not telling me another problem. Isn't my baby sick enough? He can't get rid of the carbon dioxide. What did that mean? What it meant was that if Garrett's body did not get rid of the CO2, the organs in the lower half of his body would begin to die, and we would lose him in a matter of hours. Can you understand all of this? My son was diagnosed with a very fixable heart condition, one that, although serious by definition, was controllable as best they could tell. Focus on the positive, they told me. Yes, there was a mortality rate. This I knew. There's always that risk with any kind of surgery, and especially when dealing with the heart. But that was not going to be the case with Garrett. My God was going to supply all my needs, and my need at that time was to keep my son with me. He had all of that to begin with, the AV canal and coarctation, then to have him born and find out about the extra coarctation, the hypoplastic left heart, and the leaky valve was unbearable. But now they stand before me and tell me that there is yet another problem with my son's health, and they can't figure out what it is. Before I knew what was going on, there were at least 8 to 10 doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners surrounding Garrett's bed. It became an open discussion about what this could be and what they needed to do to get it under control. These doctors began to speak in terms that I did not understand. They started brainstorming ideas about what to do with my son. All the while, they included us in on the conversation. I found myself pushing into this crowd of medical personnel and becoming one of them in conversation alone. As soon as someone new would enter the room, they would spot Mike and I standing by the bed and walk right over to us, introduce themselves, and explain what they were doing in this situation. As the doctors and nurses continued to discuss and decide at random, different ones would pull out of the group and come over to us to explain in detailed layman's terms what was being said. This went on for over an hour. They were completely baffled and made no bones about letting us know that they were not sure what was happening in Garrett's body. The problem itself was why they were unable to determine what was happening. By now, they were confident that it was pulmonary related, but an MRI and CT scan were out of the question. To do either procedure would do something fatal to the blood gases in his body, thereby ending his life. To try to figure out what was wrong would in effect be fatal. Yet, though they did not know the problem, they assured us that they would do everything in their powers to figure it out and correct it. When I think back on that day, Thursday, from the beginning to the heartbreaking end, I'm still in awe by the magnitude of it all. I had never heard of doctors treating a family in this manner. We were never once asked to leave our baby's side. If something needed to be done, they worked around us or asked us to step back, and that just momentarily. We were never excluded from any discussion or decision. As a matter of fact, we were the ones who made any decisions that needed making. We were never treated as if we were unable to understand or did not need to know. If we asked any questions, no matter how many times we asked it, we were answered promptly. Not only were we answered promptly, but it was not diluted or dismissed. We were given complete and heartfelt compassion. Now, here were these doctors telling us that if we didn't figure something out fast, Garrett would not last another 3 hours. This news was not even related to his heart. The best that anyone could figure was that Garrett had an existing pulmonary issue when he was born. His lungs were already bad. How much more can a person take? I am here to tell you that a body can withstand anything given it if that body has the will to survive. I speak out of experience as I've come to learn that with that I speak out of experience as I have come to learn that with the will I can survive anything. There were so many doctors working hard for my little guy. They all wanted to do the right thing for him, and they cared about the parents just as much. The talk over Garrett, what could be wrong, what they could do, how soon it needed to be done went on for quite a while. However, it seemed as if time stood still at that point. I remember Dr. Avihu Aziz, Dr. Nathan, of course, Dr. Barbara Farber, at least 2 interns, Colby, another nurse, Bev, and others whose names have failed me were all around Garrett's bed. The remarkable thing about this is that every one of these people, doctors and nurses alike, talked to us. What is so important about that? I don't mean that they made general small talk to fill the awkward silence. I mean that at any given point, one or more of those nurses and doctors would stop what they were doing, leave the discussion, come to us and explain in full detail what everyone was talking about. There was not any part of Garrett's experience in the hospital that we were excluded from, and I do mean absolutely nothing. Nothing happened to or around my son of which we were not first informed and then included. Quickly, a decision was made, for it was apparent that it needed to be done right then. They all agreed that Garrett's heart was indeed serious. If the coarctations were not immediately fixed, the oxygen would not disperse to all parts of his body. This was the priority heart surgery, but it couldn't be done until the leaky valve was fixed. These were all critical, requiring immediate attention, but nothing could be done at all until the lung issue was resolved. Garrett had to be in a position of releasing the blood gases from his body, or surgery of any sort would be fatal. That is when the decision was made to remove the breathing tube and place Garrett on a respirator. We gave the go-ahead, and the transfer ensued. We were able to stay just outside of his room for this procedure, and so I watched from a distance. The procedure was a success, and praise God, Garrett's blood gases began to level off. I took a small breath and thanked the Lord for the victory I felt was mine to claim. Yes, it was a victory, however small for the moment. As it was, without it, I would have said goodbye to Garrett on Thursday afternoon. Yes, praises went up and out for all to hear. It was the last praise that I could give on that day. Garrett's blood gases had leveled off, but it didn't take the doctors long to realize that his heartbeat was falling and not rising again. What could be the cause of this? All of Garrett's heart conditions did not affect the pumping aspect. He was able to pump on his own, and he did so quite strongly. He had, in fact, maintained a strong and steady heartbeat his stay thus far. Did I mention that Garrett was quite the fighter? I said that he reminded me of a little boxer when I first saw him. I said that was because of all the fight he had in him. I thought that fight was to get him past this time in his life with his heart. I was sure he would need that fight later on to get through the following surgeries. Yes, he was definitely filled with fight. You see, everything wrong with Garrett at this point should have already taken him. However, I soon came to my own understanding that the fight he possessed was there to give his mama more time. Well, we were at another fork in the road. A decision had to be made soon. Many thoughts and possibilities were thrown out and mulled over. It was finally decided to place a pacer in Garrett's heart, a temporary pacer actually. They had to put a temporary pacer in his heart just until they could get him through surgery. They went over the reason for needing this and explained the procedure. We okayed the pacer and waited for it to be put in place. They brought in yet another doctor, and he went over everything with us again. Dr. Farber had already ensured his qualifications. She told us he was unbelievably good, very confident and sure of himself, but not without cause. He was, in fact, the best around. Mike and I were comforted by this because, as you can imagine by now, Dr. Farber's word was gold. I trusted her inexplicably. She made herself available to us in so many ways. She shared stories of her children with me, I'm sure to make me feel comforted. She asked about my children and even asked to see pictures. I told her that we were going to be spending the day with them on Friday in the lounge while we took turns spending time with Garrett, and she asked if she could meet them. How many doctors are there in the profession that take time out to visit with their patients' families? I know of one for sure, Dr. Barb Farber. So for now, we were waiting for the pacer to be placed behind Garrett's heart. This would regulate his heartbeat and bring it back to a normal rate. Again, this was a procedure that could be done in his room. Once more, we were asked to stand outside Garrett's room, and so I stood by the door and waited. Again, a successful procedure, and again, I took a deep breath, although this time it wasn't without hesitation. Don't get me wrong, I'm not all gloom and doom. I was relieved and thankful. However, they had told us that this was just a temporary pacer. A more stable temporary pacer would need to take this pacer's place. The doctor who did the pacer would need to replace it right after they had this one in. I went into the room and saw my son for a few moments before they needed to move him to the cath lab to put in this new pacer. This was a simple procedure that would allow them to do the heart surgery that Garrett so desperately needed. They assured me that he would not need this pacer his whole life. They were going to be able to remove it after he was successfully through his first surgery. That was the goal anyway. But I knew by now that things were being played by ear. So many things kept changing, issues kept developing, that I was becoming leery of hoping. As it was, we met Dr. Farber that day around noon. It was at this point in the journey, close to 9 p.m. We had been on this up and down seesaw for close to 9 hours already. Even though they were delivering good news, it was followed by bad news with only worse news to follow that. Again, I do not think myself to be a pessimist. I believe I'm pretty upbeat and positive. But as you can imagine, I was grasping at straws by now. Alrighty, folks, it looks like we've come to the end of our story together today, but not the end of our journey. So until next time, keep your head up and stay inspired.